Well, for more on this now, we're joined by experts Liepollo Pheko in Johannesburg and Dr. Oloo in Nairobi. Let's start with you, Ms. Pheko in Johannesburg. Just talk us through the political and economic significance of the Chinese president's visit to the UK.
So the UK and China have quite a long, sometimes fractious history that goes back about 5 centuries. Clearly, they have also had their own history of economic, trying to be dominant international powers. And at the moment, it seems that China, in terms of the economy, is on the ascendancy. I suppose most significant is that the Queen, the Duke of Cambridge and several members of the royal family received the President of China. So it was extremely high profile and of extreme importance in terms of diplomacy, political diplomacy, as well as economic diplomacy. It should also be noted that it comes at a time when certainly the internal wranglings of the European Union have the UK more likely than ever to perhaps cede or depart from the European Union subject to a referendum. They'll certainly be looking for different market options, and certainly if they leave the European Union in years to come, they want to be able to guarantee some kind of market access to a huge population, such as the kind that China offers for them. And of course, they're also aware of their own, international rivalries between them, the United States and China. So it's not all entirely, a kumbaya. It's also about securing their own geostrategic and geoeconomic interests.
Well, let's turn to you now for a moment, Dr. Oloo, here in our Nairobi studio. As Ms. Pheko there just said a moment ago, the Chinese president has indeed received a rather grand and royal reception. What is your assessment, however, of the Chinese president's visit to the UK so far?
Well, I think you have to look at it that he's going there after 10 years before a Chinese leader went there. And I think, as Ms. Pheko has said, you have to look at it from the past perspective that China is a giant in Asia and the world, and Britain is also a giant in the European Union. And one has to look at it from the perspective that Britain kind of has not been overly comfortable in the European Union. Remember, they didn't join the Euro. And as Ms. Pheko said, there's a referendum which is coming soon as to whether they will cut relationships through a referendum. And therefore, they have to get ready. One has to also look at it from the perspective that there have always been calls of not having harmonious relationship with China because of its human rights record. But as David Cameron clearly said, was that they might not agree on certain issues, but certainly that will not stop them from continuing to talk. And that goes along the way China has always said that at times you don't have to mix business with politics. And therefore, from this perspective, I guess Britain is looking at a period in which it's not going to strategize for its agenda using the European Union as the vehicle, but to go as Britain alone. And I think it is from that perspective that one has to look at it. And from China's perspective, it's basically that it is reaching out, given that the president of China was just recently in the US during the 70th celebration, and now in Britain. Those are the core countries of the West. And I think China is basically saying that we have come of age and we are a key player in the international scene.
Well, Ms. Pheko, let's come back to you for a moment there. You spoke of this, of the matter of strengthening diplomatic ties. Now, one has to wonder how the African continent can benefit from improved ties between China and the UK.
I don't think there'll be benefits per se, but I do think that it's important to highlight that China is not in the business of one or the other. They are aggressively and stridently securing bilateral and plurilateral agreements with several regions, just as they're signing off this agreement with this huge £30 billion agreement with the UK. They are simultaneously trying to tie up a deal with Australia And of course, they also have tied up successfully 2 years ago a China-Africa deal, a Sino-Africa trade agreement, which is to the value of about $200 billion US. And I think there was, at some point, some people were a bit concerned that perhaps this would divert the attention from the African market. I don't agree with that. I mean, Africa has, the African continent and African countries have several commodities, several resources which are not obtainable anywhere else in the world. China is aware of this. The European Union is aware of this, which is why they also have been pursuing their own bilateral agreement through the economic partnership agreements over the last 12 years or so. And I don't think that there'll be benefits per se, but I do think that it does make it, it does perhaps mean that there'll be some form of leverage in terms of the competitiveness, and I think the insecurity that the UK in particular, as a traditional trading partner with the African continent and several former so-called Anglophone countries, has felt, as has France over the last few years, and they've been displaced certainly as the preferred trading partner over the last 5 to 10 years. And I think that this perhaps begins to allay their fears, the UK's fears, that is, that they are being displaced in some way. So that perhaps is one of the key benefits that will come out of this for the African continent. But in terms of tangible day-to-day economic and political benefits, I don't see them. I see it as a kind of a residual soft diplomacy that we will benefit from as African countries.
Well, let's take that issue then to you, Dr. Oloo. Of course, that matter of Africa's traditional trading partners. Now, in terms of international diplomacy, can African countries strike a favorable balance between the traditional support of Western countries like the UK and our new friends in the East?
Yeah, I think that diplomatically Africa should harvest from this. You'll remember and recall that one of the questions over the so-called Look East policy from African states has always been that you are abandoning your traditional allies who have always been there for you. But in this case, you see that the US and Britain, which are the leading countries from the West, are also reaching out to China. So at this stage, nobody can blame Africa for looking east when their traditional allies also are trying to buttress their trading with the same East. And therefore, I think that what Africa should strategize on is diversification, whereby the trade with both the West and the East, insofar as it helps them grow their economies, and as also when it helps them have a bargaining power. So I think they should approach it from the basis that the world is now a global village and there's no iron curtain, and anybody can diplomatically align with any side as well as trade with another side. And I think the question would be, does Africa go in this as the African continent, or do they go each as sovereign states and engage in bilaterals? That will be something to watch over.
Well, Ms. Pheko, of course, Dr. Oloo mentions diversification there. What else, in your opinion, should African countries do to fully gain from the increasing interest being shown by both China and the UK in investing in Africa?
And indeed, other the BRICS regions, Brazil as well, Russia and India, I think that we're in a much more favorable position than we have been over the last 20 years. I mean, the so-called lost decades as a result of structural adjustment, etc., have certainly placed us in a much more bullish and positive economic outlook. As we are well aware, 7 of the leading, the fastest growing economies in the world are on this particular region. And everybody, in fact, I mean, we talk about looking east, perhaps we should be looking about, looking south, looking towards Africa, because every region in the world is aware that, we are growing and the sun is very much rising. And I think this puts us in an important position to be able to leverage and to negotiate on terms that make sense to us. I would like to see us, rather than just trading in primary commodities, to insist on far more value chain beneficiation in terms of our trade agreements, far more transfer of intellectual property, far more transfer of technology and skills, so that in due course we are able to do more with our economies and graduate them much more from primary to secondary. And I think we also have the opportunity to renegotiate things around taxes and tariff bindings, import and export taxes, to insist on favorable terms on which to export our taxes into the European market and beyond. And that is really one of the sticking points and one of the reasons why the EPAs, the Economic Partnership Agreements, have been stalled for about 12 years, is because many African countries feel that it's really an attempt for the European Union to flood our markets with their surplus goods all over again, and turn us into a consumptive economy rather than one which is a partnership of equals and of peers. So we have the opportunity right now, especially whilst the European Union and many European countries are going through their own recession and flux, and rather desperately holding on to their own internal cohesion, to be a bit more strident and assertive, and understand that we have so much to offer the world, and we essentially don't need the approval and the kind of to seek the kind of trade relations that have been a feature of the post-independent African state, the post-colonial state. We can be a lot more assertive and really ascend as much more equal and vibrant partners.
We'll have to leave it there, but thank you very much for that analysis coming from Ms. Pheko, the Executive Director of the Trade Collective in Johannesburg. And another thank you to our guest here in Nairobi, Dr. Oloo.